Right, good morning everybody. It's Mark Bredenkamp here from East London. We're unable to do the broadcast this morning, so I'm going to give you a quick, short little session, and I'm sure you're going to find it absolutely wonderful. I want to talk and answer, very briefly, frequently asked questions. Some of the questions we've received from you, some of the questions from others. But let's have a quick look on how to hear the voice of God, questions that often arise. Number one, many people ask me, how do you know the difference between God's voice and Satan's voice? Well, I think there's basically two or three dynamics here. Number one, by the mistakes you make. I know that sounds crazy, but in the beginning of my ministry, when God was training me like he did Jeremiah, he said to Jeremiah, what do you see? He was a young man. He said, I see the branch of an almond tree. He said, you've seen well, Jeremiah. Let me explain to you what it means. Then he said to Jeremiah again, okay, now what do you see now? He said, I see a pot, a boiling pot, and it's boiling. He said, you have seen well, my boy. Let me explain to you what it means. So here we see God training the prophet, because prophets cannot be taught to be prophets. They can be taught the principles that govern the prophetic. But God trains his prophets himself. Now, so the first thing is, when God speaks, you have a vision like Jeremiah had. You need to get God to give you, and this usually happens in the beginning of your training, and then God will give an indication, or you'll just look at it and say, well, it's the maybe I'm going to walk down the road today and I'm going to see this fruit that's just grown supernaturally. I'm going to eat it and become all powerful. I'm just being silly now, but you know what I mean. And we go and pick the fruit. In the meantime, it's in the guy's yard next door, and he comes out with a shotgun and he chases you, and it's like, but hey, now God, I saw that clearly. I must, and my interpretation was I must eat it. So what I'm trying to say to you is, by your mistakes, there are three voices that will come to you: your voice, God's voice, and Satan's voice. And usually you'll quickly find out which is God's voice by virtue of the fact that when you listen to Satan or yourself, it's not going to be usually very good. It's going to be a flop and a failure, and God takes that in your humility to train you. Okay, that's the one. The other one is, how do you know the difference between God's voice and Satan's voice? Remember this: Satan has no creativity. His words always cause confusion, self-examination. Confusion and self-examination. God's voice never does that. God always makes statements that defy our present state of affairs. Satan's voice always demands that you qualify for the task, usually demanding the attention of yourself rather than the mission. So remember, Satan has no creativity. His words cause confusion and self-examination. In that, you'll usually find the residue of fear, etc., anxiety, and so forth and so on. He always makes statements that defy our present state of affairs. When God comes to give him, he says, a mighty man of valor. At the end, he says, go in this might of yours. So he's speaking a contradiction. He's speaking a defiance to the present state of affairs. Let's just say, for example, you have financial trouble right now. And in your financial trouble, you hear a voice that says to you, you're not going to make it. I just want you to know that's because what you did was you invested in that thing, and you knew you shouldn't have, because I told you not to do it, and now guess what's happened? You've lost all your money, and so I'm going to cause you to become a poor person, poorer than a church mouse. That's not God. Okay? Another thing is, God, as a rule, there are extremes, but as a rule, in 33 years, I don't think I've ever exposed a man's sin in the congregation. I've rebuked some people, but never exposed. And that's another dynamic. Satan's voice will always cause you to feel guilty, come into condemnation, ask you questions about whether you're good enough, are you okay enough, will you do it okay? No. Satan will always demand the attention to go on yourself, your flaws, your failures, your challenges. God doesn't speak like that. God will speak to you relative to the mission. He knows all the problems that you're going to face. He knows where you're going to fail, where you're going to fall, where you're going to sin. He knows it all from the beginning. And yet he still chooses you because it's the mission he's focused on, not your sin, not yourself. Okay. Number 2, here's another question. Is it ever an audible voice you hear, or is it just a knowing that is in your heart? Well, one of the major things in hearing God's voice, or how to hear God's voice, is to perceive the form or appearance rather than an audible voice. God appears rather than speaks with a voice. Therefore, you will know before you hear. So you've got to recognize the form of the Lord. And, the way that you recognize and perceive the form of the Lord, God said concerning Moses, he said these things, and he even recognizes my form, the form of the Lord. And, we know the story again of Gideon, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him, there's the form, and said to him, the Lord is with you, mighty man of valor. And he complains and he mows. And then the Lord said to him, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? And he continues to argue and debate the point. And again, we see the same story. Eventually he recognizes the form. This is God speaking to him. And, if we take a look at, we see, and as for Balaam, and when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she laid down under Balaam. So Balaam's anger was aroused, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, what have I done to you, that you have struck me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, because you have abused me, I wish there were a sword in my hand, for now I will kill you. I would kill you. So the donkey said to Balaam, am I not your donkey on which you have ridden ever since I became yours to this day? Was I ever disposed to do this to you? And he said, no. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed his head and fell flat on his face. That's Numbers 22:27-31. And you look at it, you see there, Balaam had to recognize the form. He didn't recognize the form. Immediately he starts going into a discussion with a donkey. I find it very funny because I'd either rebuke that donkey or say, yeah, speak, Lord, That's when God's speech gets real weird. Some Christians feel that visions and dreams and prophecy are like weird, it's very supernatural. I tell you what is crazy is when your cat jumps up in your bed and starts talking to you. You better recognize the form of the Lord there, right? There were 3 men for Abraham. That was the form. Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. And we've actually covered the form of the Lord in the last one I sent you. So after his resurrection, let's look at Jesus. Jesus appeared to many people, but they were not able to hear him simply because they did not recognize him, his form. So on the road to Emmaus, he appeared to some of the disciples. They had no idea who he was and only invited him to continue with him because of his words. Once their eyes were opened, they said, did his words not burn in our heart? It's just so, and Jesus is having this whole big discourse with them, talking Luke chapter 24, verse 13-32, you can go read it. And so, if you read that story, I don't believe that the disciples would have said that if their eyes were not open to his form. Because really, at the end of the day, this entire discourse is very long. So it was, I'll take from verse 15. So it was while they conversed and reasoned that Jesus himself drew near and went to them. Because they were busy talking about all the things which had happened. But their eyes were restrained so that they did not know him. And he said to them, what kind of a conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad? Then the one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? Have you not known the things which happened here in these days? And he said to them, what things? So they said to him the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us when they did not find his body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said, "He is alive." And certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but him they did not see. Then he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken? Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?" And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, expounded to them all the scriptures concerning the things that concerning himself. So then they drew near to the village where they were going, and indicated that he would have gone further. But they constrained him, saying, "Abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent." And he went in to stay with them. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, that he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, "Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us on the road, and while he opened the scriptures to us?" So I don't believe the disciples would have said that if their hearts were not open to his form. The words of God must burn in your heart for it to take course and bring about change. You must perceive where he is and recognize him by divine perception, and the unveiling of your eyes before his words will ever burn in your heart and have the correct effect on your life. Stop listening and start looking. Stop listening and start looking. Once you find his form, you will hear his voice. Selah. Here's another question. Will my sin block me from hearing the voice of God? Will my sin block me from hearing the voice of God? No. Sin does not block you from hearing, but rather it blocks you from recognizing him when he appears. When the disciples were on the boat in the middle of the storm, remember, they saw his appearance in the storm, but refused to hear because of their fear. He was speaking, but the sin of fear blocked them from seeing him. Remember that he almost passed by them because of this. Okay? So many times God has already spoken to us through our conscience, and we ignore this because it's not audible, for example. But it is actually extremely audible, the form. You know, God can speak through creation. God can speak through a bird. I'll never forget. I was working with a bride of Satan, and I could not get a breakthrough with this girl. She came from the West Rand, and what a terrible life she'd lived, and she was living with us, and I was just desperate to see her freedom. And I'll never forget, after an incident where I'd given her my only prized possession that I had, which was a little tape deck thing, I'll never forget how the power of God hit her because of the giving in obedience to God. Now, about a week or two prior to that, and that was a turning point, we were at my place. Much later after that. We were still working with her, and we were at my place. I'd managed to get a place to stay. Someone had given me a place to stay in somewhere in Krugersdorp, close to Krugersdorp. So anyway, we were busy sitting there in what was kind of like a little space. It wasn't a lounge or anything like it. It was like a little space. And it had two chairs there, and there was a big window that was open there. And I'll never forget how we'd gone through this incredibly intense session. I was really drained and getting no breakthrough. Suddenly a little bird appeared, and the little bird began to peck at the window, and I was amazed because usually the bird would just fly away, seeing us there and so forth, but just continued to peck on the window. And I noticed that Isabel had begun to stare at the little bird with intent, and continued over and over, and was just pecking at the window, peck. And after about 20 minutes, that bird didn't fly away. About 20 minutes later, the bird took off. But just before the bird left, tears were streaming down her face. And I said, "Izzy, what just happened now, man?" And she just said these words: the devil, Satan, could never have created anything so beautiful. Now how's that God speaks to her through that? And that's where the turning point came for us. How about this one? Many years ago, I was driving, also a bride of Satan. Her name was Natasha. She had tried to kill me with demonic power that was, at the time, extremely intense for me. And it was there that God actually gave me the power to strike her down with death, which I never exercised. I could have, but I didn't. I chose not to. And it's my choice. When He gives you the power, it's your choice as to how you're going to operate with that and express it. Now, I said, that's enough. I could, do you know that God has given me the power and the authority to strike you down dead? And she said, she knows that, and I didn't. But the next day I said, pack your bags, I'm taking you back to Pretoria. That's where she resided with her parents. But she'd been with us for some time. She was causing havoc anyway. So the road from the West Rand to Pretoria, there's like that, it goes by via Krugersdorp, and you just go straight along that road. And while we were driving, there was no window in the back of the car, because the brother of the Ram had given me free air conditioning and thrown a brick through the window. But there was the storm that suddenly came upon us, and it was one of those Johannesburg storms where the clouds are so dark, it's like the middle of the night. It's pitch black out there, and it's pouring with rain. But I mean, you can't see. You can't see 5 feet in front of you, and your windscreen wipers are going, and it's actually very bad. You should really just pull off the road at that stage. But my heart was going out to this young witch that was on the back seat of the car, and I just suddenly we were going not even 5 kilometers an hour. I remember that very clearly. And I just raised my one hand up to heaven while I'm driving, my hand on the steering wheel, and I just said these words: in the name of Jesus Christ, I rebuke the storm. I command the clouds to open, the sun to shine, and the rain to cease, in Jesus Christ's name. And I just carried on. Well, we dropped her off, and 2 weeks later, well, actually it was very, very interesting, because all of a sudden, it happened. I mean, as I prayed, literally it was like the dark sky just went open like a path of light, and it just dissipated, and the rain stopped, and we had clear skies again. It was the craziest thing. Well, I was kind of used to that, believe it or not, and I'd done that at least 3 times, just commanded the weather and obeyed me, in the name of Jesus Christ, of course. Now, 2 weeks later, she sent me a letter, which I still have to this day, and in it she writes how on the backseat of that car she laughed and she mocked and she scorned me, because she thought I was crazy praying like that. Nothing's going to happen. She said, suddenly, her eyes just went open, and she saw these giant hands taking a hold of the darkness in the sky and pulling the clouds apart, and a voice came forth. She says, I know what that is. It sounds like a voice, but you just knowing. And it said these words: just as I've removed the darkness out of the sky, I can take the darkness and remove it out of your life, if you'll give your heart to me. How's that? Now there's a deluxe sinner right there. I can assure you of that, from cannibalism, you name it. Now her real name is not Natasha or Natasha. There's various synonyms and different names we use. But the fact of the matter is, God can speak to a sinner. Right? Now, let's have a look. Somebody once said, do you consider your conscience to be or ever represent the voice of God? Yes, many times. God has already spoken to us through our conscience, most of the times. And we tend to ignore this because it's not audible. But it is actually very audible. Can a child carry the voice of God? Absolutely. Throughout scriptures, you find that children carried the voice of God, specifically Samuel and David. On the battlefield, David became the voice of God. So absolutely, children, I love children. They fascinate me, and I always watch to see what the Lord would say to me through children, always expecting God to speak to me through the form of a child. Is God speaking all of the time? Another question, is God speaking all of the time, or does he stay quiet at times? Well, I believe that God has already spoken before we were even born, and it remains in the atmosphere or if you will, the spirit world, until we access it. He will usually guide us to that place, but it has already been established in the spirit and ready for us to hear. That is quite a mouthful right there. But many times the biggest challenge we have is, honestly, we don't recognize his form. We think God can only speak to us through the guru, like the big prophet or the big pastor of the groot pastoor. It's not so. What we need to do, always look at the conditions that are surrounding your life to see what has prevented you or I or them from hearing God's voice. Elijah was filled with fear when he ran from the words of Jezebel. Eventually this progressed into self-righteousness and pride. Then he boldly made the statement, I only have not bowed my knee to the prophets of Baal, I alone. And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, not take my life. So God passed by and the earth shook, but God wasn't there. The wind howled, but God wasn't in it. Then the fire came, and God wasn't there either. And Elijah was kind of used to all of these. And as the prophet waited, there was suddenly a still small voice that said, Elijah, what are you doing here, Elijah? So what I'm trying to say is that we need to recognize this fact, that he was not positioned in the place where you could hear God. He was on the run, in fear, and his perception was clouded with anger and pride, because he was the only one who had stood against the prophets of Baal, and now he felt that God had let him down. Due to all of these factors, he had positioned himself in such a way so that he had no idea of what God wanted. God had to get back to questioning, as he did with Adam and Eve, Cain and others. What are you doing here? This question had to be answered before God made him aware of his positioning and redirect his focus. So remember in the garden, Adam, where are you? Cain, where's your brother? Elijah, what are you doing here? What am I saying to you? How do I know when it's God speaking? Even Elijah had to search for God's voice before he could hear. And he ran for his life because the words of Jezebel shook him. We know the story that Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, so let the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. So here we see that oftentimes God has to come and ask you a question before you'll be able to actually hear his voice. He loves to ask questions, and usually he answers them himself. So it's just maybe one more little thing here. Remember that God creates by speaking. The voice of God is not some newfound phenomena. It begins at creation. It began at creation. God created light by speaking it into existence. He said in Genesis 1:3, let there be light, and there was light. In the same manner, he created the earth, the vegetation around life, animal life, mankind, all this stuff. God spoke it, and it happened. One of the basic principles of prophecy is that God's voice creates something new in our lives. God's voice always creates. It's creative. He'll supply us with direction, guidance, and knowledge, which we do not already possess at the time. This nonsense about the prophet saying, there's going to be a civil war by the end of June, hallelujah. That ain't God. That ain't God. I know how God speaks, but I also know his voice. But I also know how he speaks. I know his language. That ain't God. I can tell you that right now. That's Satan. And that's what got me out of my wilderness experience. I was so mad. With not a scant thought of the multitudes of men, women, and children that would be slaughtered and die in this nation, if there was such a thing as an uprising, a civil war. I went out that very day and I said, there will be no civil war in this nation, in Jesus Christ's name. How can I do that? Because God gave me the authority and the power to do it. Simple as that. I'm not anything special. It's God. So with his authority, his power, his name, I speak a contradiction to the satanic suggestion. And God spoke to me through that form, prophesying a civil war and my death. And I was then able to bring a contradiction. Prophets are able to bring a contradiction to the satanic suggestion. Okay? So he will supply us with direction, guidance, knowledge. God created man with his words and his breath. His purpose for Adam and Eve was to give mankind dominion over the earth and fill it with righteousness. And he said, be fruitful and multiply. God spoke the words in Genesis 1:20, be fruitful and multiply. If he had simply breathed into us, or breathed into Adam, Adam would have been a living being without a purpose or a destiny. God has to speak. He had to speak in order to create the desire and ability to be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. See, when the wind comes to you, it has to contain God's voice before any purpose can come out of it. So when God speaks to something, and when he creates something, be fruitful and multiply. If he didn't speak, if he only breathed life, the breath of life would be living beings, but with no purpose, no destiny. Be terrible. So that's why it's important for you to be able to hear the voice of God. The voice of God is only a sound to those who are conscious of their weakness and sin. But to those who are aware of their position in Christ, the sound is a clear voice. I mean, look at this. In John chapter 12, 27, 29. Now, my soul is troubled. I've taught you on this, but anyway. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. Therefore, the people who stood by and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, it was an angel that spoke to him. So, it was only a sound that didn't become a voice. Because many people around us are conscious of their weakness, their sin, just like the Israelites when they went to the promised land, the giants. And you all know that story so well. Now, I love you guys. I'm actually extremely tired. I didn't sleep last night. I'm working on a very important article. Please pray for me for strength. I must finish it today. Guys, I need your help. We were unable to meet our budget at the end of last month, and we now have to meet our budget today. So guys, please, give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. More than enough will men give into your bosom. People, it is the most powerful principle to financial security, is to give. Selah. I love you guys. Have a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day down here. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll make it through the day. I'll have to go and sleep for about 2 hours. But bless you guys. Pray for me that I can finish these tasks that I'm busy with and right now. And they are incredibly powerful. So God bless you. We'll speak to you soon. Love you lots. Ciao. Okay, guys, just one more thing, and that is, what is a voice? What is a voice? The sound, the word voice simply is the sound produced by the vocal organs of a vertebrate. A specified quality, condition, or pitch of vocal sound a hoarse voice, the child's piping voice, a sound resembling or reminiscent of vocal utterance, the murmuring of the forest, etc. You can recognize various aspects of a person by their voice. A child's voice can be recognized by the piping voice. The pitch of their voices can differentiate the voice of a man or woman. Thus, various aspects of a person can be recognized through their voice. That's very important. Agitation, happiness, excitement can all be discerned by the sound of the voice. So, a human or animal is known by the sound of their voice. However, there can be heard the howling of wind, the murmur of the forest, and the roar of the sea, which gives a voice to things not human or even alive. God's voice opens your spirit to comprehend and to perceive destiny and a future. That's important. Don't always listen for an audible voice, guys. It may not be something you can hear with your physical ear, but rather it is something that you must perceive. I wonder if anyone can truly say that they know exactly what God's voice sounds like. God is not human, but he is able to take the human larynx and articulate his feelings through or to someone, or he can use a talking donkey to express his message. He can speak in a still small voice, as he did to Elijah. He can speak through thunder and lightning flashes, the sound of a trumpet and smoking mountain. That was in Exodus chapter 20, 18 to 19. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. He took on the voice of a human being when he spoke to Samuel before he fell asleep. Samuel thought it was Eli, the high priest, speaking to him, and went over to find out why he was calling him. As Moses walked on the mountain with nothing on his mind but the safety of sheep, he discovered God's voice in a burning bush that didn't burn. So, God can speak through a billboard, a child, or a song. Why do we try to confine him into our minuscule human resources? People, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. So let him decide how he wants to communicate with us, and just enjoy the ride. Shakespeare once wrote, "My voice is in my sword." And when we read this, one can realize that a voice is not always a sound or a certain tone, but an action as well. So when Elijah was at the place of extreme despair, he sought after God's voice. There were 3 manifestations that were presented to him, but he could not find God. God had passed by, and the specific proof of his presence was by the manifestation of an earthquake, a whirlwind, and then fire. But God was not in them. So what do you mean, Elijah? God was not in them. How do you know? Look, even though God was present, this did not benefit Elijah because he had to hear God's voice in order to move on or get direction. So God's voice in a move of the Spirit adds substance to a very powerful manifestation that would otherwise be ineffective. Think about that. Okay, I'm going to say it again. God's voice in a move of the Spirit will always add substance to a very powerful manifestation that would otherwise be ineffective. Even though God was present, it did not benefit Elijah because he had to hear God's voice in order to move on or to get direction. I hope you guys are getting me what I'm saying. So, substance means essentially nature and essence and the integrity of the heart, the substance. A manifestation of God without his voice will only make you an observer and not a possessor. Okay? There are plans without substance that are presented on a daily basis in business meetings throughout the corporate world. A person who has character, personality, and strong virtues is labeled a person of substance. There are many beautiful human beings outwardly but contain no character or special qualities that would add to their beauty. The minute they open their mouths, you are able to assess, to a very large degree, the value of that person. So to discover the character and heart of God, you have to hear his voice. Remember our text right at the beginning? God says, "Why do you not understand my speech?" And he answers, "Because you do not hear my word." Right? So there's so much more we can talk about, but perception is the ability to have insight and foresight, and that's where we're going to continue on shortly. God bless you guys.